In section 1.4, there's going to be a few things that we're going to talk about, but the main idea that we have here is order of operations. Before we get into the actual order of operations, I want to just talk about one thing real quick to make sure we're on the same page. That thing is exponents. Now, with exponents, you're going to be dealing with an expression that looks something like this. Okay, that is not 5 times 3. That's a 5 to the third power, or sometimes you would call that 5 cubed. Okay. Now, what that really means mathematically is 5 times 5 times 5. Okay. Now, what we're doing with an exponent, again, it's not multiplying 5 times a 3. You are taking this exponent, and that tells you how many times to take the base and multiply it by itself. Okay, so the base is 5, and we multiply it by itself 3 times. Now, 5 times 5 times 5 gives you 125. If you can't just do that in your head or you don't have that memorized, that's okay. Just make sure you take your time with it. If I was actually calculating this out, do 2 at a time. 5 times 5 is 25. 25 times 5 gives you the 125. Okay? And there you have it. Now, there's a couple other little nuances that I want to make sure that we're clear on. First thing, let's look at a fraction. Again, fractions are the cause of a lot of anxiety for some people. So I want to make sure that we see this for what it is. Okay? It's 2/7 squared, or 2/7 to the second power. However, with fractions, what we can do is basically take that exponent and put it on the numerator and the denominator separately. So what we have is 2 squared, 7 squared. Okay? So it's not 2/7. You're squaring a 2 and you're squaring a 7 separately. That's much easier to handle. So what we have is 2 squared is 4, 7 squared is 49. Okay? Now, one last thing that I want to make sure we're very clear on is something like this. There is a big difference between those two expressions. Okay, it doesn't look like much of a difference. One has parentheses, one doesn't. But we need to read exponents very, very literally. In this case, that square is only attached to the 3. So what we have is a negative 3 times 3. That negative simply drops down. Over on this side, that square is attached to the entire negative 3. So it's negative 3 times negative 3. Okay, that gives you a very different result. This case, it's a negative 9. This case, it's a positive 9. Again, a lot of people look at this and say, well, okay, I forgot the negative, not a big deal. It is a big deal. These little details that so many people are, it was pretty close. We need to really focus on that, because imagine going to the bank and expecting this in your account, but instead you have this. Maybe throw in some zeros. That's a very big difference. Okay, so it's a very small symbol, very big difference. So please pay attention to those details as we go through. Okay, that's the gist of exponents. We're going to work a lot with exponents when we get into chapter 5, but right now these are the basic calculation aspects that I want you to have down. Now let's actually go into order of operations. Now, order of operations has 2 main ways that people use to remember what that order is. The first simple one is PEMDAS. Okay, a lot of times people can sometimes say, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. That's how I was taught years ago. But please excuse my dear Aunt Sally, or PEMDAS, same thing. What those letters stand for are parentheses, exponents, multiplication, division, addition, and subtraction. Okay. Now, if you just read it, okay, no big deal. But there are a few details that a lot of people overlook when you're using this list here. First of all, parentheses. Really what that should be saying is grouping symbols. It could be parentheses, absolute value bars, brackets, braces, any of those things. So parentheses, really, we should be thinking grouping symbols. Now, the other thing with that is when we deal with multiple grouping symbols, you always work your way from the inside out, okay? And we're going to see an example of that in a couple minutes. But it's not just you do all the grouping symbols at one shot. If there's multiple, work on the inside and then slowly inch your way outward. Exponents is exponents. Multiplication and division, those actually happen at the same time, okay? You don't want to be doing all multiplication, then all division. These occur at the same time, and you go left to right. Same thing with addition and subtraction. Same time, left to right. So there's not really 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different phases or steps. There's 1, 2, 3, 4 that we should be focusing on. Okay, let's see some examples of this in action. What we're going to be told to do is evaluate, okay? Now, we're not solving anything because these aren't going to be equations where we get x equals 5 or something like that. We're just going to be calculating through an expression. So let's start with something simple. Okay, 4 divided by 2 times 5. Now, if we go through this list of order of operations, there's no parentheses, there's no exponents, but then we go to multiplication. But remember, don't just multiply first. Multiplication and division should be happening at the same time, left to right. So it's not 2 times 5 that we bring our attention to. It's the 4 divided by 2. Okay, so what we do is this one calculation. 2 times 5, 10. Okay? The reason why we have these rules is to make sure that we all get the same result, the same one correct result. If we just said, okay, just do that, okay, then we would pretty much be getting 2 different answers, whether we're in this class or we're here and someone else is in Russia, okay? We want everyone throughout the world, let alone in this one class, to get the same result. That's why these rules are set in place. Okay, how about something like this? Okay, little longer problem. We're still going through the same amount of steps though, okay? Now, first thing is that parentheses, but really we're thinking grouping symbols. So we have a problem in front of us. There's a problem within that and a problem within that. So it's this that we start with, okay? That's what I mean by working your way from inside out. I'm going to do this innermost part first. Everything else comes down without being touched. And we got that, okay? Now, the parentheses here aren't really necessary anymore. However, they're not hurting anything. We still want to go problem, problem within that, but there's really nothing inside there that has to be carried out. So what we're dealing with now is this problem here, okay? This is its own problem within the problem. So we're going to go to these exponents next. So I've got 5 plus 2, 12 times 12, or 12 to the second power, is 144. And we got that. Okay. Now, some of you may have added these first. Okay. The problem with that is you might look at that and say, okay, 5 plus 2 is 7. But the problem with that is you just added before you multiplied. Okay. So don't go for convenience. Make sure you're following the steps and following the rules appropriately. Okay, so again, we still have this problem within the problem. Left to right, I'm going to add and then subtract. 6 plus 144 is 150. Then I subtract. And then I have these brackets here. Those brackets don't really mean anything special, okay? At this point, all they mean is that we're multiplying in this part right here. The reason why they use brackets is so that we just didn't have parentheses everywhere and then it would be visually confusing. So we're going to multiply next. And then we add. And there we go. Okay. I forgot to say this before the problem, but since these are on this is a video that you guys can pause. If you feel like you have a concept down and I write a problem on the board, pause it and see if you can work it out on your own before I do it. Okay. That's a very good exercise to do. If you don't feel ready for that, don't feel like you have to or you're obligated to. But if you feel pretty good, you think you understand it, by all means, hit pause. I'll be here when you get back. Okay. Let's do one more like this. This next one is more of a fractional expression. So let's look at that. Now, there's a lot of nuances to a problem like this. First of all, I don't want you to do a step, do a step, do a step, do a step. When I see people do that, it's easy to lose focus, okay? I like to treat this fraction bar as its own grouping symbol, grouping this part of the problem and this part of the problem. I like to do this top, start to finish, and then the denominator, start to finish. You have two problems in one, essentially. Focus on one at a time. So if we go up here, these absolute value bars are a grouping symbol, okay? But we can't really cache those in until we're ready. So I've got a problem here. I got a problem within that. So everything stays put except 8 plus 7 is 15. Notice I'm not even touching this, okay? Not yet. Next, within this grouping symbol, I have this multiplication. And then I subtract. And now absolute value of negative 40 is a positive 40. Okay? Now, in terms of the calculation, like 3 times 15 or something like that, try to use the calculator as little as you possibly can. Those are skills that everyone needs practice on. And if it's been a while, and by a while, it may be 2 months, 3 months since you've dealt with something like this. There are some summers where if I don't do a lot of math, I come back and it takes a week for me to kind of get my routine back in gear. So please don't rush into this, okay? If you need to take your time with it, take your time. Try to use the calculator as little as possible. On an exam, that's a different story. But when we're doing our homework, try to do this on your own as much as you can. Now, that's the numerator. The denominator, I have to do this, okay? Some of you may be thinking distribute. I really wouldn't do that. Not that it's wrong, but I would only do that when there's variables involved here. We'll see that in the next couple sections, okay? I would go with do this first. So I've got 3, and then 7 minus 4 is 3. All that means is multiply. So I get a 9, and then I'm done. I can just carry that over to here, okay? Now I took this big fractional expression, and now I have a normal fraction with a numerator and a denominator. Now, one thing I want you to be aware of is at this point, sometimes those fractions can then be simplified after that. But in this case, that's the best we got. When I say simplify, I don't mean to write this as, what would that be, 4 and 4/9 as a mixed number. That's not what I mean by simplify. I mean something like 15 over 3. I wouldn't leave that. I would just simplify that down to a 5. Okay? So when we do these fractional expressions, just make sure that you look for that at the very end. Okay? That's pretty much the general order of operations discussion. As always, if you do have questions, please reach out and I'll take care of them. There are a couple other things, though, that this section does cover that I want to make sure we're all on the same page with. Before I get into that, though, I want to say one more thing about that list of order of operations that we had. Pretty much everything that we talk about in this class in terms of lists or formulas, I do want you to have memorized, because those things are going to pop up randomly in any math class that you are going to have from here on out. So it's really going to help you out later if you have those memorized. Don't force it, though. Don't sit there for 3 hours and stare at these lists because you have to have them sunk into your head. If you have a list like this that you're not comfortable with yet, then take out a note card or a sheet of paper, write them out, and use them. When you're doing your assignments, have that sheet of paper sitting out. And the more you look at it, you're naturally just going to have that memorized. Stuff like tedious stuff, like memorization, we want to try to happen naturally. So it's not, I'm forcing it, and I'm stressing, because then it doesn't typically stick. We want things to just come normally and naturally. Okay. So let's move on to the same instruction as we had before. However, it's going to be a very different problem. They're going to give you an algebraic expression, something like this. Okay. But then they're going to fill in something like that. So evaluate this expression when we have these values here. These are going to be given to you the same as the expression. Now, what we need to do with this is take these numbers and put them in place of those variables. Now, I want you to be aware of what a variable is. Think back to first grade, okay, where they gave you something like that, and they said fill in the blank. Okay, I think we all remember doing that long time ago. All algebra is when we take this blank and we put a variable in place of it. The reason we put the variable is so now we have something tangible that we can actually move around and work with, okay, as opposed to just some blank box. Now, when we plug these in, I want you to first reintroduce that idea of the blank box, okay? What I mean by that is I'm going to rewrite this as x squared plus 5y. Not 5y, I'm sorry. 5 with a blank there as well, okay? Now, when we put those blanks in there, we now have everything we need if necessary. Now, what I mean by that is, remember one of the first things I talked about in this section is when we had parentheses with an exponent, okay? They are never going to hurt if they're not necessary, but if you need them, you need them. So put them in. In this case, I would put the x like this and the y like this. If I didn't have those parentheses and I just put it in there for the x, like so, that's a very different result. So first thing, always put those parentheses so you don't forget them. Get into that habit. Now, once we get here, we're back to the order of operations problems that we were talking about a couple minutes ago. So I'm going to start with this exponent. Negative 2 squared is negative 2 times negative 2, positive 4, plus, let's leave this here, 5 times 3. If you wrote the 15 right away, that wouldn't be wrong. But again, the more things you combine, the more likelihood you have of making a mistake. So just take your time. Next, I'm going to do that multiplication. And then finally, add those up. And there you go. The important thing about this is putting those parentheses first, then plugging the numbers in after that. Another type of problem that's similar to this is going to be looking like this. Now, that's an equation. What an equation is when you have one expression equaling another expression. Okay, this is a single expression, but this is where we have two of them that are the same. When we get into chapter 2, we're gonna talk about how to solve these things in great detail. But right now, they're going to say, here's an equation, and is 5 a solution? So let's say you or someone else ends up solving this and they say, oh, 5's an answer. How do you check that? Okay. Now, what we're going to do is the same thing we did here. We're going to plug the 5 in. But we're going to have an expression on this side, an expression on that side, and we are going to try and figure out or see if those expressions come out the same. So first things first, 3x plus 10 equals 8x. Okay? Now, plug in that 5 everywhere you have a blank spot. 5 and 5. Now, our goal is to evaluate each of these expressions and see if they come out the same. Order of operations. Multiply first, then add. We get a 25. The other side, 8 times 5, that's just a regular old 40. Those are not the same. They're not equal. Therefore, is this a solution? No. That is the actual answer and result that we're looking for, is that answer of no. Okay? Now, what if, same thing, same equation, but my question is 2 a solution? So how about 2? Okay, same idea. We're going to be plugging that in. Okay, don't forget those parentheses. 3 times 2 is 6. We get a 16. And here we get a 16 as well. Now that those match, we can say, is that a solution? Yes. Simple as that. Just take your time when you're going through that. It's a very simple process, but there's a lot of detail within that process. Okay? One last thing. We will be dealing with a lot of word problems in this course, and I don't want you to stress or worry about that just yet. We can worry about it when we get to it. But what they start to do in this chapter is to get you thinking about just basic translation from words and phrases and sentences into expressions and equations. So I don't want to talk too much about that. I can take questions if you have them, but there is one expression that I really want to make sure we're clear on. So I'm going to ask you to translate the expression 3 less than a number. Okay, this is one that causes a lot of problems, throughout the sections and chapters that we cover. 3 less than a number. Okay, think about what that should look like algebraically. What I typically see people answer, okay, there's 3 answers that I typically see. I sometimes see that. I sometimes see that. And I sometimes see that. Those are the 3 results that people typically give me. Now, only one of those is correct in this case. First of all, this one up here is wrong because 3 less than a number, if it was written this way, it should say 3 is less than a number. That's, again, just a 2-letter short word, but it makes a huge difference in meaning. So this is out. 3 less than a number. Both of these recognize that less than means that you're lessening something, you're subtracting or taking something away. Okay. However, order matters with subtraction. So one is right, one is wrong. The correct one is this. Okay. Really think about that phrase and what it's saying. It's saying that you are taking 3 less than something. So if I have $10 and I have 3 less than $10, how much do I have? I have 7 because it's 10 minus the 3. It's that number lessened by 3. So whenever you see that phrase less than, just think, switch the order, and subtract. There are a lot of other phrases that they talk about in this section, but this is the one that I think causes the most confusion and problems for people. But if there are other ones that you find that cause you some issues or confusion, please feel free to reach out and I can help you out. Okay, so that concludes section 1-4 with order of operations and some other basic plug and chug type of stuff. Keep working hard Ask me questions if they come up, and I'll see you later.